At 17 years old, I find myself in a dire situation, having been forced out of the house my father left me after his passing. My mother and stepfather have drastically transformed my home, converting my bedroom into a nursery, and unjustly branding me a freeloader in an effort to expel me. My family life has never been idyllic. My parents struggled with infertility for years until my mother miraculously conceived me. Despite their initial joy, the marriage was strained and fraught with frequent, intense arguments. These conflicts often centered around my father's gambling and my mother's drinking, habits they both vowed to quit. Yet, my mother secretly continued to drink throughout her pregnancy, causing a severe rift that escalated to a dangerous altercation involving a thrown pair of scissors, resulting in a serious injury to my father. My grandparents often shared with me the volatile nature of my parents' relationship. After I was born, my parents seemed briefly unified in their care for me, but the harmony was short-lived. My father would return from work to find my mother incapacitated by alcohol, neglecting her duties as a mother, while I was left in distress. This pattern of neglect continued, and the home environment deteriorated, with my mother often drunk and the house in chaos. My grandmother would visit to find me unkempt and the house in disarray. After numerous attempts to intervene, she finally convinced my father to place my mother in a rehabilitation centre and took me into her care for several months. Today, I am urgently seeking guidance on how to handle the current crisis, being evicted from my own home by my mother and her new partner. This upheaval has left me disoriented and desperate for advice on navigating this complex and painful chapter of my life. Living with my grandmother were the happiest days of my life. She nurtured me with bedtime stories, nutritious meals, and frequent trips to the park, a sharp contrast to the home I knew. Unlike my mother, who was quick to anger, my grandmother offered a calm and loving presence. She never scolded me harshly or punished me for accidents, such as breaking a plate. Under her care, I felt genuinely safe and loved, something that seemed almost motherly, surpassing anyone else's attempts to look after me. I cherished her deeply, unable to imagine surviving without her. Despite frequent visits from my father, who relayed messages of longing from my mother, I dreaded the thought of returning home. My wish was to stay with my grandmother indefinitely. However, when my mother achieved sobriety and proudly showed her AA sobriety chip, she immediately came to take me back. It was unsettling to see her after such a long separation. She seemed like a stranger to me. We were told I'd move back with my parents that weekend. Despite my protests, my mother insisted, emphasizing her role as my parent. Returning to a house filled with dark memories was painful. The transition affected me deeply, leading to an eating disorder at just 5 years old. My parents sought family therapy, helping us mend our past slowly. Life seemed to improve. My parents stopped fighting, my mother remained sober, and my father reduced his work hours to be more present. However, stability shattered the day my dad and I returned home to find my mother with another man. The confrontation that followed was intense, with accusations flying and blame shifting. My father was devastated, demanding she leave. That night, my grandmother picked me up amidst the chaos. I stayed with her for 5 weeks as my parents tried to sort out their marriage. Despite my mother's daily calls pretending to care, I felt her self-interest was her true priority. My dad eventually chose to stay in the marriage, pushing for counselling. Despite this, my view of my mother was irreparably altered. As if our family hadn't faced enough turmoil, mere months later, my father was diagnosed with stomach cancer, following severe pains that led to his collapse at work. This sequence of events only added to the complexities of my childhood, marking a profound period of my life filled with both deep love and painful betrayals. As my father's health deteriorated rapidly, we faced long days filled with chemotherapy sessions and restful recovery periods. Dad had set aside some savings, and my grandmother was ready to assist financially, but my mum struggled with the situation. She often lamented about the burdensome costs and emotional toll of the medical treatments. My dad suggested she take up part-time work to help, reassuring her that he'd resume his role as the primary breadwinner once he recovered. Reluctantly, she started working as an expediter at a restaurant, often returning home late into the night. During this challenging time, my grandmother would drive my father to and from the hospital. Meanwhile, our neighbour, who had a daughter my age named Amelia, generously offered to drive me to school each day. Amelia and I quickly became inseparable friends, bonded by our daily routines and shared experiences. Although many in our neighbourhood were aware of my family's tumultuous situation due to frequent loud arguments at home, Amelia's family welcomed me into their lives. They often invited me over for meals, countering my mother's harsh view that I was just a charity case to them. To Amelia's family, I was more like an extended member, even making sure to have apple pie, a personal favourite, ready when I visited. Amelia's parents also introduced me to basketball, with her dad spending evenings teaching me the game. This family provided a sense of normalcy and belonging that was starkly absent in my own home. Eventually, Amelia and I began dating, a relationship that brought a tremendous amount of positivity into my life, despite my complicated family dynamics. Unfortunately, my mother never warmed up to Amelia or her family, yet their kindness never wavered. A year into my father's battle with cancer, his doctors delivered the devastating news that the chemotherapy was no longer effective, and he didn't have much time left. This realization broke our hearts, and I struggled to grasp the impending loss of my dad, the one parent who consistently showed me love. In his final months, Dad made every effort to spend as much time with me, my mum, and my grandmother as possible. One morning, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. The pain of losing him was overwhelming, and I was inconsolable until my grandmother arrived to provide some comfort. At my father's funeral, an unexpected revelation came during the reading of his will. It turned out he had left everything, his house and remaining assets, to me. My mother was visibly shocked and questioned the lawyer, even inquiring if there was a way to contest the will in court. Dad's decision was made when he was of sound mind, reflecting his desire to secure a stable future for me, free from the financial and emotional instability my mother might bring. My mum's displeasure was evident, but the legal standing of the will was solid, leaving her with no real basis to challenge it. This provision by my father not only aimed to protect me, but also to ensure that I had the resources needed for a good start in life, something he deeply cared about. As I navigated these complex family dynamics, I became ever more grateful for the support of my grandmother and Amelia's family, who stood by me through the most challenging times. When my father passed away, all I had left of him was our family home, filled with memories. So, when my mother suggested selling the house to move somewhere better shortly after his death, I was adamant about staying. Despite her clear disappointment, she didn't have a say in the matter and continued living there with me. However, just a couple of months later, she dropped another bombshell. She had reconnected with someone and wanted me to meet him. My surprise turned to dismay when I realised it was John, the same man she'd been involved with years earlier, the one my dad and I had caught her with. I couldn't hide my disgust when we met at a restaurant and he reached out to shake my hand. I refused, incredulous that my mother would think I'd accept him. As they displayed affection openly, my mum tried to explain that rekindling with John was just her way of finding happiness after Dad's passing. But their coziness only fueled my suspicion and resentment, reminding me of the late nights she'd returned home during Dad's illness, claiming overtime work that might have been clandestine meetings with John instead. The dinner was uncomfortable, and I ignored John's attempts at conversation. My mother was furious with me for being rude to her boyfriend and claimed marrying John would provide me with a positive role model. I flatly rejected the idea, telling her I'd rather live alone than with someone who had betrayed my father. Despite my objections, she married John and he moved into our house, asserting his dominance and even removing photos of my dad and me from the living room to the basement, claiming they needed a fresh start. John's controlling nature didn't stop with my mother. He tried to impose curfews on me too, but I stood my ground, reminding him he wasn't my father. My evenings were spent either at Amelia's house or at the library, where I could study in peace, away from the tense atmosphere at home. Throughout this period, I maintained a close relationship with my grandmother, finding solace in our visits filled with old movies and memories. As I navigated my high school years under these strained circumstances, my mother's presence in my life continued to wane. She didn't attend my high school graduation, which didn't surprise me, though it was still a disappointment. Thankfully, my grandmother and Amelia's parents were there to support and celebrate with me. That very evening, as I was preparing to go out with friends, my mother informed me that now that I was an adult, I needed to take responsibility around the house. Confused, since I had always contributed, I realised this was yet another way for her and John to assert control. However, with the support of my grandmother and friends, I was determined to forge my own path, undeterred by the challenges at home. Right after my high school graduation, my mother dropped a bombshell. It was time for me to get a job and start contributing financially to the household expenses. She mentioned that John felt I wasn't pulling my weight. Although I was frustrated by the timing, she didn't even give me a day to celebrate my achievements. I agreed to help out and soon landed a job at Burger King. Alongside this, I applied to various colleges and was accepted into a local college, which meant I could save money by living at home instead of needing campus housing. However, I did need a car for commuting to classes. When I approached my mum about possibly helping me with purchasing a car, both she and John reacted negatively. John accused me of being selfish, despite the tight finances they claimed to have. My mother sided with him, telling me I was on my own. This response was particularly hard to swallow a few weeks later when I discovered workers remodelling our kitchen and bathroom. It seemed they suddenly had funds for home improvements, but not enough to help me with a basic necessity like a car. My confusion turned to frustration when my mother dismissed my inquiries about the remodel, accusing me of feeling entitled. As the house transformations continued, I kept to myself, feeling increasingly isolated. Amelia, my girlfriend, noticed my distress and did her best to support me. However, the situation escalated when I came home one day to find my belongings piled in the living room. My mother and John called me downstairs for a serious talk and excitedly announced that my mother was pregnant with John's child. They had been keeping the pregnancy a secret for over 3 months. John then stated that they planned to convert my bedroom into a nursery for the new baby and that it was time for me to move out. They described me as a freeloader and suggested that I move in with my grandmother until I could afford a place of my own. Feeling utterly rejected and unwanted, I didn't argue. I quickly called an Uber, grabbed my important documents, and left for my grandmother's house. She was just as shocked and angered by their treatment of me. While she was eager to confront my mother, I wanted to seek legal advice first to understand my rights in this bewildering situation. The whole ordeal had left me reeling, but at least I had the support of my grandmother during this difficult time. Having recently turned 17, I found myself in the middle of a legal and emotional battle regarding the ownership of my family home. The house was legally mine, according to my father's will, yet my mother and her new husband John were living there. Uncertain of my next steps, I decided to consult with a lawyer to understand my rights and the legal procedures I needed to follow. The lawyer confirmed that the house was rightfully mine and advised that the first legal step was to issue a formal eviction notice to my mother and John. If they failed to comply, I could then proceed with legal action against them. Armed with this information, I felt a mix of relief and resolve. With my grandmother by my side for support, I visited the house while my mother and John were out. I didn't bother ringing the doorbell. Instead, I called Amelia's dad, who kindly agreed to help me change the locks on both the front and back doors. By the time my mother and John returned, the locks were changed, and I was ready to confront them. Standing on the porch with my grandmother, I refused to let them inside. My grandmother, undaunted by John's visible fury, firmly told them they had 26 days to vacate the premises as I had plans to sell the house. I handed them the eviction notice, which my lawyer had prepared, outlining the 26-day period and the legal ramifications of non-compliance. John, red with anger, crumpled the notice, but my grandmother coolly informed him that his actions wouldn't change their situation. As the confrontation escalated, my mother began to plead, citing the stress of her pregnancy and the inconvenience of moving. However, years of neglect and resentment boiled over, and I couldn't hold back. I rebuked her for her years of absence and neglect, especially during the time she was incapacitated by alcohol rather than caring for me. I told her it was time she and John stopped relying on me and found their own place. Despite her pleas, I stood firm, driven by years of feeling unsupported and exploited. John, realizing his keys no longer worked, began to yell, but it was clear the locks were changed and their time in the house was coming to an end. I had made my decision, and there was no turning back. Having just turned 17, I was thrust into a challenging position of asserting my rights over the family home, as per my late father's will. During a tense confrontation, I told John that he was technically trespassing, and I wouldn't hesitate to call the police if they didn't start preparing to leave. It was both gratifying and sobering to assert such authority, emphasizing the reality that I was ready to take legal actions if needed, which could potentially deplete their finances while I recovered costs through the sale of the house. I firmly stated that I had nothing to lose, and my grandmother and I would be staying in the house to ensure they were actively moving out. Caught off guard, John and my mum tried to retaliate, but I stood my ground. I reminded them that as the legal owner, I set the rules, and if they found them too harsh, they were free to find temporary accommodations elsewhere. I even offered to move their belongings to the porch myself. Their expressions mixed with anger and desperation, but it was clear that the dynamics had shifted. This was my house, and it was time for them to respect that. As word of our family dispute spread through a viral TikTok post in our small town, I addressed online queries about the 26-day notice. It was a precaution advised by my lawyer to ensure there was no legal backlash against me. Regarding the money John spent on home renovations, I stated that I was willing to reimburse him if he provided legitimate bills, as verified by my lawyer. Many also wondered why my grandmother and I chose to stay in the house during this period. The reason was straightforward: to prevent any claims from them about their rights to the property, especially since they weren't paying rent. I also refused to give them a key, underscoring their lack of tenancy rights. Despite their initial compliance, my mum and John eventually tried to overstay their eviction notice. I took decisive action by moving their belongings to the porch while they were out. When they returned and unsuccessfully attempted to involve the police, I provided proof of ownership, and the officers informed them that their only recourse was through the courts. Faced with this reality, they had no choice but to leave. In the aftermath, I secured my property with surveillance cameras and began the process of selling the house. I've been working with a mortgage broker who will start showing the house to potential buyers soon. This ordeal has been a tough but vital lesson in standing up for my rights and handling my affairs independently,